The Baltimore Ravens experienced major turnover on their offensive line this offseason. We look at the hopes, concerns, and much more when it comes to that group. All that and more coming up next year on this episode of Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host here with you, Kevin Ostreicher of Ravens Wire, and we're here with you on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, thank you so much for being here and making Locked On Ravens a part of your day and your first listen each and every single day. We're free and available on all podcasting platforms. So in video form on YouTube and audio form wherever you get your shows, you can like, subscribe, and follow along anywhere you decide to get your podcasts and your shows. We're 5 days a week here of daily Ravens coverage. Today's episode of Locked On Ravens is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. We are back here, midweek edition of the show, and here with me is Ken McKusick of Film Study Ravens. Ken, always appreciate you taking the time and talking Ravens football with me. It's been a little while since we've talked on this show. I know a lot has happened this offseason for the Ravens, particularly their draft class. We haven't had a chance to talk about that here, you and I, but how's it been for you this offseason so far? Any surprises, concerns, anything that's going on?
Busy. I guess there hasn't been any really big injury news. There's been a little bit of a bad news about how long it might take for Mitchell to come back. But other than that, all the free agency losses were, of course, expected, to a degree disappointing, but to another degree, set the Ravens up for another set of comp picks that is a system they've used well.
Yeah, if they didn't have that limit of 4, I think the Ravens would be rolling, not that they aren't already, but rolling in comp picks. I think eligible for 6 or something along those lines. Obviously 4 is the maximum you can have, but it cuts off at a certain rate there. But you're right, expected losses, and part of those losses, which I know we're going to get into a bunch today, Ken, is on the offensive line, where, look, you lose John Simpson, Kevin Zeitler, and Morgan Moses. I think let's start there with those guys. Obviously, Zeitler was the beacon of consistency, or at least one of them, on that Ravens offensive line. He was such a solid veteran for them over his years there. Morgan Moses, I thought, turned in some decently solid years for them. And then John Simpson, I think, exceeded everybody's expectations in terms of what he could do. I know it wasn't necessarily the greatest year for John Simpson, but him coming in as a guy that was probably a roster cut in most people's eyes ends up starting the full season for him. So those are guys that I think the Ravens will miss, particularly Zeitler and Moses.
All right, well, let's start with each of those. Zeitler, a guy who was pretty much the North Star for the offensive line during his time here. Oftentimes you sign an offensive lineman in your 30s to a 3-year deal. You'd expect him to play 2 years. Towards the end of Yonda's career, it was a 2 to make 1 deal. At least one time, might have been more than one time. Derek Mason, a similar guy. Ed Reed, towards the end of his Ravens career, similar 2 to make 1 deal. So you don't really expect the entire contract to be played. Zeitler not only played the entire contract, he made his first Pro Bowl in his last year, is the glue that held the offensive line together in terms of being a mainstay in offensive line calls, also being a very solid, dependable blocker. Did not have the greatest pass blocking season, had some injuries towards the end. I think that had to play into the Ravens' thinking in terms of not re-signing him, because what he was signed for was very little in a relative sense. So it's a little bit surprising to see him go in that from that standpoint. Would you like to respond to that, and then I'll move on to the next player? Or how do you want to do this?
Yeah.
So the next player, let's talk about John Simpson. John Simpson, a guy who came to Baltimore with a ton of penalty problems, won every 95.5 snaps. 95.4 snaps actually when he was in Oakland. He reduced that all the way to 1 every 95.5 snaps with the Ravens, which would mean it's an awfully 500 years or so before he becomes a good player in that regard. So it's really not surprising to me that the Ravens didn't make an attempt to re-sign him. Very surprising the kind of money he was offered by the Jets. I know it was a guard-centric early days of UFA period that really led to a lot of those signings. So that was interesting. The nice thing about the Ravens in the draft last year, the Voorhees pick looks like an even bigger deal in terms of he's really, I think, is going to be plugged in as the left guard starter pretty much from day one of his real NFL careers on NFI the whole year. So the Ravens still have him for 4 years. They have a chance to get a tremendous payoff, a guy who certifiably already has grown man strength at the position and doesn't come into the league with the same kind of penalty history that Simpson had. The guy who did, by the way, Josh Jones, and I apologize because on my pod, if you listened to this already when we were talking about Tyler Linderbaum, you heard me talk about Josh Jacobs, but Josh Jones actually has 36% more penalties per snap played than John Simpson, which is a scary thing because they didn't fix John Simpson. So they've got to fix Josh Jones if they're going to get him in at either tackle or guard. Right now, it looks like Josh Jones is the first backup at guard to me, and that Ben Cleveland will be the starting right guard when everything shakes out. I know they've done some different things in OTAs, but we also saw last year when Saleh was installed at left guard at the beginning of OTAs, and that was some combination of a motivational journey for John Simpson or just the Ravens trying to see if they had a ball player in Saleh over there at left guard.
Right. And I think, again, you're trying to replace both of those guys, two starting new guards, but also at that tackle position with Morgan Moses was not on a bad deal. 3 years, $15 million, the Mark Ingram special, if you want to call it that. That's the deal Ingram got as well back in 2019. Is Moses a guy that you thought slowed down over his second season? Did he perform well? What was your overall thought process on Morgan Moses now he played?
The Ravens are obviously concerned about injuries that accrued during the season.
Sure.
They're concerned about the shoulder injuries and what. But I'll tell you a couple of things about Morgan Moses were completely unexpected. And by and large, I think he way outplayed his contract. And he was very surprising in the sense that he became an outstanding pulling tackle. And I did not expect that. The Ravens run a lot of counter plays or plays where two pullers go from one side to the other. In probably 97% of those kind of plays, the tackle is the trailing player. You occasionally pull to the outside, but much more commonly, you pull following either the center or the guard on your side to the other side. Morgan Moses had a tremendous record of being able to have the field vision to locate blocks and enough quickness and mobility to both keep his momentum and find a block effectively. I was extremely impressed with his work in space. So much higher level. And I think he pretty clearly had the two best years of his career with Baltimore. He played obviously in some platooning roles, some rotational role, I should say, at times last year. I think in a way, some of it was a concession to injury. I think some of it also was to make Ronnie Stanley feel better about what had to go on the left side, that he had to play some fewer snaps. They put McCary in for him. They put Faalele in for Moses, and they stagger substituted so the two of them, the two replacements, were never in the game at the same time. So that was kind of an interesting way to do it. But Morgan Moses, extremely satisfied, actually modestly surprised with the amount of turnover on the offensive line and the shortcoming the team has at offensive tackle that they did not retain him.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people, it was widely understood that Zeitler, Moses, Simpson, even Ronnie Stanley were never long-term pieces on this offensive line. And there was always that question of how many players are they going to move off of? How many are they going to keep? Obviously, they kept Ronnie Stanley, a contract revision, chops off the last year of his deal. I think a lot of people understood that, look at his former salary, his former contract, there was something that had to get done in terms of lessening that, making it just a better deal for both sides, particularly Baltimore. Are you now more comfortable with him on his current contract and the potential that he can maybe, just maybe, turn into a potentially healthy season?
Yeah, he played well in the last 4 games of last year, so I'm excited about that. In fact, I know you wanted me to talk some about grades on this show. Stanley's as good a place to start as any, but Stanley had a very tough year through the San Francisco game, but Miami, Pittsburgh, and the 2 playoff games, he played very well. Grades leading up to that point were D, F, C, D, D, B minus, C, F, C, F, F. And that's not Ronnie Stanley. Had a 0.60 points per play, which is right in the middle of the D range after adjustments. That's a raw score was 0.60. Then that improved to 0.63 when the last 4 games are folded off. He had an A, a C, and an A, and a B plus in the AFC Championship game. Just playing at a different level of aggressiveness. He still does a good job of mirroring such it's very difficult for opposing players to get by him for a sack, but he also this last year in particular was giving up more ground to maintain his mirror. Lamar Jackson is actually very comfortable with that situation. He takes bump pressure from the blind side very well, can move from it, does not seem to be affected, doesn't generally take his eyes down like a pocket quarterback typically would, and kind of get lost in his thoughts and whatnot and make a big mistake. Lamar's much more likely to evade that, move around in the pocket, and make a throw. So that really worked for Stanley for years, even in 2019 when he had an all-pro season, he was giving up a lot of that. But I think the last 4 games, if you look at that, are the reason to hope that Ronnie Stanley can return and have a big year. I think that he was not going to play for the Ravens pretty much no matter what in 2025. I think it becomes even more likely he will not be re-signed for 2025 now, because he'll either play well and be out of the Ravens price range, or he'll play poorly. And I think you'd have to then think there's a possibility he'd retire.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think actually part of the rotation that you talked about, I think that benefited, obviously it was for injury and keeping guys fresh.
Mm-hmm.
Ronnie Stanley, I think, benefited from that as much as anybody. While I don't think that's a sustainable method, I think, ideally you play your 5 and that's it. But I think some of that uptick in production and uptick in just in being a better player was because of being able to sit for a little bit, get right. And maybe at this point in his career, it's just like, look, can he fully hold up? Hopefully. But a low rest, I think, went a long way for him.
Yeah. One thing that is kind of disturbing about what happened is that in the draft now I'm talking about, is that I'm not convinced the Ravens took best use of the 1-year landing strip they had to figure out their left tackle problem. They've got a guy in Rosengarten, and honestly, the left tackle board got pretty well stripped before they had a chance to pick, with Guyton being the last reasonable possibility probably at that spot. And then they after that, you really talk about some developmental players and players like Suamataia or Amagaji out of Yale, or Rosengarten is in that group. Rosengarten, not so much a developmental player as much as his anchor might just not ever be good enough to play in the NFL. So we'll see if he can develop that anchor. He's got a lot of the very nice footwork you want. The question is can he hold up? And the Ravens, they've put their eggs in the Rosengarten basket. Hopefully it works out. And if it does, we won't be unhappy about it at all. If it doesn't, we'll look back at this draft and maybe have to consider that it was either a missed opportunity or just bad luck that the Ravens didn't have a tackle really fall to them.
Yeah, that draft board, it fell in so many different crazy ways that I don't think a lot of people were expecting. And I think Rosengarten was just a product of player at that point. Obviously, you could have made a play for Kingsley at that point, and that could have been the pick. I know there's a bunch of conversation about kind of how that all unfolded between the Ravens, the Chiefs, and the 49ers. But for Rosengarten, an interesting point you brought up. I want to talk about that in the second part of the show. So coming up here, we'll talk about Roger Rosengarten, some concern about the new starters, some hopes for them as well. Stay tuned. We got a lot to get to here on the show. First, the show is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience, a formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors is everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has it covered. With over 120 million parts, your number one ride or die, always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. Or the parts you need, or the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Elsewise, all exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. We are back, our second segment, Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher and Ken McKusick still talking with you here on this Wednesday. Ken, you mentioned Roger Rosengarten. We haven't had a chance to fully talk about him. I know you talked about him a bit just a couple minutes ago there. But based off of how the draft fell and Rosengarten as a player, do you think he fits what the Ravens want to do on offense? Do you think he fits their vision of a long-term tackle? And do you think it is realistic to see him as somebody that could be a 5 to 10 year starter in this league? Or is that anchor you talked about so much of a concern you're not there yet?
Oh, I'm not there yet in terms of believing that's true, but I don't like projecting a high standard like that on anybody coming right out of the draft. I mean, first of all, a lot of linemen struggle in their first year in the NFL. Sure. So Rosengarten is a guy who, if you look at most of the year, he was perfectly fine defending the blind side, as everyone wants to talk about, because Penix is left-handed at Washington. So he was perfectly fine in that role for most of the year. The national championship game, he gave up, by my count, either 9 or 10 pressures in that game. PFF, I think, has him scored for 5, but they have him for like a score in the 30s. That's particularly concerning for several reasons. First of all, that was one of the defenses that actually challenged that Washington offense in a lot of ways. Washington offense had elite playmakers all over the place that were making it very easy to move the football. But second of all, they really threw out a fairly pedestrian group of pass rushers against Rosengarten. It was a 7th round draft pick in Harrell. They did have an underclassman who's going to be better, and I've forgotten his name right now, but they had some other guys who are just, they're not particularly obvious NFL caliber players. And, even if they were, even if he had faced somebody who was pretty good, I still would be concerned about that particular game. And it was a game where he got pushed around, got pushed into the cone. A lot of the pressures were ones where they wouldn't make Lamar comfortable. Lamar, we talked about in the earlier segment, did very well with Stanley mirroring and allowing bump pressure from the blind side, which then he was able to keep moving, keep his eyes down the field, and did very well with. I don't think anybody likes to have the cone impeded. That's really not makes it a lot harder on any quarterback. And that's the danger with Rosengard. He's got arms that are a little bit shorter than normal, but that's not really the issue. The issue for him is his build such that his anchor will really hold up at the NFL level. And it's going to be a big test for him. It's great to have Linderbaum turn a leaf from his rookie year to his second year and have that be so much better in terms of being a pass blocker. I mean, that's night and day. In terms of difference, it's the biggest single uptick in apparent skill of any Ravens player from year one to from 22 to 23. Brandon Stevens being a close second. But I to project that again for Rosengarten would be really going out on a limb. If it works out, I mean, I think he's a left tackle or bust in the end. And I think if it works out, we're going to be very happy. If it doesn't work out, we obviously won't be. And I can't give you a percentage on that.
Do you think there were better scheme fits for the Ravens at that point? Would you have taken a Kingsley? Would you have taken somebody else waited later? Or would you maybe have gotten aggressive and traded up in the first round to maybe secure a Guyton or somebody else?
Yeah, the trade up idea I liked for Fatano. If they really wanted to trade up and trade away, Isaiah Likely or something, I could have seen trading up all the way to number 11 for Fashanu. I could have seen trading up for Mims, who's played mostly right tackle. And I misread the market on the guy who went number 7 or whatever, who a lot of people had much lower.
Latham?
Yeah, Latham, Alabama. I misread the market on him because I thought he might be one of the players that would drop into the 20s and the Ravens would have a chance, but no way in hell. The draft actually started to go sour when the Chargers, who were not expected to picked a tackle at number 5. As soon as Joe Alt went at that point, you knew the run on tackles was only going to accelerate. And that's exactly, unfortunately, what happened. And not everybody got a tackle they're really happy with. Unfortunately, the Ravens, even picking where they did, and with the thought that there would be a left tackle on the board, there really wasn't one that was really exciting.
Yeah, there was the run in the first round, then there was another run in the second round. And again, it left Baltimore with a couple of choices. But I'm interested because Baltimore clearly wanted to get younger on the offensive line. And clearly, when you inherit an offense as an offensive coordinator, obviously they went from Greg Roman to Todd Monken. You kind of work with what you have in that first year for the most part, depending on when you're hired. But then that first full off season is where you can fully shape out some of the personnel groupings, particularly on the offensive line. And it felt like they just wanted, hopefully, younger, more athletic and longer term pieces. Is that the reason you think they decided to undergo this transition now? Why do you think they moved off of guys like a Kevin Zeitler, who was rock solid for them, Morgan Moses, who exceeded expectations, and went this young route?
So I can understand why you move off of Morgan Moses if your thoughts of where he's going to be injury wise indicate you don't think you're going to get more than 10 or 11 games out of him, say, next year. I can see why they'd make that move. I'm still a little bit surprised because he's very cheap, that they would not want to kind of take the risk on that, given how much, they were in a hole at tackle, and he to replace both tackles in a 2-year period in the draft is daunting. I mean, that is just, I can only tell you in the draft process, looking up to it, and on draft night, going through that and seeing them, Wiggins got a great player at number 30, frankly, a fantastic choice from a value perspective, but they were going to have to reach a tackle at some point. They did in the second round on Rosengarten, I think by about 20 spots, probably not necessarily in terms of where he would have been picked, but in terms of where the consensus was for him. Somebody else might have reached too, is what I'm saying by that. But they're going to put a lot more on the plate of Tyler Linderbaum, who is now clearly the leader of this line. He's going to have to do a lot of the things that Zeitler did all by himself. So he'll have to make line calls. He'll have to be aware of when they may still have some tap to tell him when Lamar is ready to take the snap. But I think that Linderbaum's going to be making all the calls at the line of scrimmage, whatever of that Zeitler might have done in this last season. And From a continuity perspective, it's all on him to make whatever guard combination they go with work. And is a big portion of his 2024 report card is going to be not his own personal blocking, but how the guards do next to you. Were they successful? So anyway.
It's a good point. And I think also for a guy like Voorhees, who I think both of us are in agreement, Ken, that he is by far and away the front runner and the likely winner of that left guard job. Playing in between Linderbaum and Ronnie Stanley should help him out a ton, as, even though Linderbaum was not a 10-year vet, he is certainly one of the best centers, if not the best center in the game. And then Stanley, who was certainly seen a thing or two during his career. But Voorhees is a player, he intrigued me even before his injury in the draft last season, was projected as a third, fourth round guy before the injury. Baltimore makes the move to trade up or trade back into the draft in the 7th round to take him. I thought it was a genius move. I know you've alluded to it as well, because he, when fully healthy, is a player that's just kind of like that lunch pail, super solid, not a ton of holes in his game. Now, the health factor is going to be big. How does the knee respond? How does he come off of that in what technically is his first NFL season? Why are you so bullish on him personally, based off of everything you've said? And why do you think this could work out for the Ravens long term?
They essentially, with Voorhees, they got a strength conditioning year for free at the NFL level. And a lot of NFL linemen come into the league and they need a year to grow into their bodies and whatnot. Now, for starters, Voorhees already kind of had grown man strength by his 38 reps that we saw at the combine. So there's just less concern with a player like that. But that doesn't mean that he's like built his body in the shape for an NFL player. And it's just not 100% of the story. So they got that year of strength and conditioning for free because they didn't pay him. They gave him probably some amount of money, but they NFI'd him for the year, so they didn't lose a year of Ravens controls. They'll still have him for 4 years. The counterexample is Ajabo, who they lost a year of, except for a handful of snaps he played at the end of 22. And now there's a real question of where Ajabo's floor and the ceiling are. With Voorhees, the whole future is ahead of him, and he could be, in part because he plays offensive line, he could be in the league for quite some time. So. We're you got to be really happy, I think, with that pick. And, one of the things that goes into this is Cleveland is a 4th-year player. So Cleveland now becomes a guy who's playing for his contract in this next year. Voorhees is a guy who they could have for a while. So the Ravens are highly incented to have those younger players work out. So both Josh Jones, who's a 1-year free agent, and Cleveland, who's a 4th-year player, they don't have as much invested in. The Voorhees is the black chip bet for this Ravens line. Both the other guys are green and red, in terms of their relative value, to put it in those terms.
Yeah, and I think with Cleveland, he's a player that a lot of people are maybe hoping can have that Ben Powers type of contract year, parlay that into a big money deal, whether that is with Baltimore or realistically probably somewhere else if that happens. Now, there have been questions about him and the athleticism overall and some of the work ethic and whatnot and everything that kind of comes with him. And by some accounts, he struggled at times during some of these early workouts. Now, I want to preface this by saying offensive lineman workouts without pads, OTAs, minicamp.
Crap.
you can't take anything away. So I don't want to just say, oh, well, look at this. Cleveland struggled during minicamp. Just season's over for him. It's done. Obviously, we have a long way to go with that. But what have you seen from him over the course of his career with maybe your grading system and what you've seen on film? And does that give you hope? Does it give you concern for what he can give the Ravens this year?
Yeah, he had a very good year and a very limited number of snaps last year. He had 163 scored snaps, and he scored 0.84 per play, which would put him in the high end of the B range. And since it's only a couple of games, it's not the thing where his aggregation of those Bs would give him an A as it is for other players. But he, he didn't play enough snaps for that aggregation to help him. But both games he played fully, which were Miami and Pittsburgh in 17 and 18. He had a B in each game and was actually very consistent between the two. I think he is a mountain of a human being who can certifiably get the torque necessary in that right guard spot. Perhaps even if things really work out at a better level than Zeitler. He'll never be who Zeitler was technically as a run blocker, but he could be a stronger player who could do more. As a pass blocker, Zeitler was in a little bit of decline last year. He didn't have a great year as a pass blocker, and we did see a great year from. We did see a good play in limited duty, I should say, from Cleveland. So I think it's reasonable to hope, given that's what he came out of school as the better part of his game was his pass blocking, that he could be an effective one, particularly playing next to Linderbaum. And I think that a lot of that will be, again, on Tyler's shoulders to make sure that holds through together. But in terms of having a big guy that you want on double teams on the inside, Ben Cleveland and anybody, I'll take.
Yeah. He is a mammoth of a man, an absolute mountain. So again, having a guy with that physical profile on your line and just the strength that he has is an absolute, it's a good thing. But again, can he put it all together for a full season? That's what I'm hoping to see from him. But those are the three projected starters. Coming up in the final part of the show, we'll be talking about some of the backups who could maybe make a play for one of these starting jobs and what their depth looks like right now, plus an overall state of the Ravens offensive line, and can the Ravens replicate their success from 2023 over to 2024. We got a lot to get to. Don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. Plenty to talk about on Locked On Ravens. We are back here with Locked On Ravens with Ken McKusick. I am Kevin Ostreicher here on this Wednesday edition of the show. Ken, we know that the projected line from left to right, Stanley, Voorhees, Linderbaum, Cleveland, and Roger Rosengarten, but that doesn't mean that is completely locked in. Now, John Harbaugh said that he would like those competitions to be over as early as possible, hopefully before the preseason. Realistically, that's probably not going to happen, but there are a couple backups that could maybe make a run here, particularly a Josh Jones, like you talked about. Let's start with him, a player that, again, is this the John Simpson type deal we saw last year, a guy that comes in, not really a ton of expectations, and then ends up having a really good year, maybe as a swing guy or an injury replacement. What do you think about Josh Jones and his possible role this season for the Ravens?
I think he's the first guard off the bench. He may also be the first tackle off the bench. McCary, honestly, probably the first tackle off the bench, particularly on the left side. Josh Jones, probably the first tackle over on the right side. Daniel Faalele is still around. I think the Ravens probably carry 5 pseudo tackles or 4 full-time tackles and a swing guy, or possibly Faalele plays some inside, because that's certainly been talked about as a possibility and might fit his skill set better. But I don't see Faalele as beating out either of those top 2 guards. And I don't see him as really taking a lot of playing time away from Rosengarten as a rookie, although it wouldn't shock me if he starts week 1 because of the long-term Harbaugh tendency to favor veterans over rookies. We saw it obviously with James Hurst playing over Orlando Brown. Didn't really make a whole lot of sense when it occurred, but it was what it was. And we certainly might see that happen again. But I do expect before the end of the season, at some point, we'll see Roger Rosengarten at right tackle. I hope we see him at right tackle before we see him at left tackle, because if he's at left tackle, that means something's gone wrong. Right. And, we certainly hope that that is not the case. In fact, it might mean multiple things have gone wrong.
Yeah.
That'd be a little scary.
Yeah. I don't want to imagine a future where that happens. Obviously, it's always a possibility with the way football goes, but for Baltimore, definitely going younger. Are you concerned about the line? Do you have hope for the line, their depth, their projected starting group? Obviously, Linderbaum is the anchor now, with Stanley hopefully filling in as that really solid veteran player. Does this line give you cause for a little bit of concern, or are you feeling okay with where they are right now?
I mean, it's a fairly young line everywhere but Stanley. So I don't really have an injury concern the way I've had in past years. So last year, Zeitler, Moses, Stanley all had injury concerns. John Simpson had a big penalty concern, and we don't have a player like that in the starting group. Although, as we mentioned, Josh Jones is that. He's got 36% more penalties per snap than Simpson did. So, there are reasons to believe that the youth probably leads to a better chance at continuity. That might be kind of a false or kind of a spurious hope, because we're thinking, we're projecting that these guys will all be football players, and that won't necessarily happen. I think Cleveland will be fine. I think the chance of Voorhees being good is pretty good. It's pretty good that he'll be okay. I think the chance of Linderbaum being good is excellent. I think the chance of Rosengarten being good at the right tackle side is up in the air. I think he could be, he might not be. So we'll see who he ends up as a player. It's just, I'm not a really high, I can never assign too high a probability that a first year player is going to be a good offensive lineman, because it just doesn't happen all that often.
Right. And something I've talked about here, and this kind of goes with the offensive line, but the roster in general, is just the way this offseason has gone, the way the draft is, and honestly, it doesn't really feel like Baltimore's going to make many moves as we head into training camp here. It just feels like, Ken, this is the year of replacement plans or succession plans, where the Ravens over the past 2, 3, 4 seasons have built up a bunch of this young talent, and now we are truly going to see what they have, where I think with last year's offseason, it was, they're bringing in vets left and right, Millette and Clowney and Van Noy and Beckham and, list goes on, Darby, everybody. And that took away playing time from some of these younger guys. But now you have second-year players, third-year players, fourth-year players, even this rookie class. And I'm expecting to get huge amounts of playing time. Do you think the Ravens can replicate their success from 2023 to 2024 and realistically expect most, if not, hopefully it's all, but realistically not. So most of these young guys to step up and perform in a way the Ravens need them to compete for a Super Bowl?
Okay. The last part, yes. Can they compete for the Super Bowl? Sure. Can they be as good as they were in 23 and 24? No way in hell. This was one of the greatest football teams to ever play this last year. They lost a critical game and broke our hearts in the AFC Championship game, but it's one of the greatest football teams that ever was. And they going out and beating the Niners, who were also one of those teams in San Francisco so convincingly, was just part of the story. They beat every good team they played prior to the Chiefs, and they beat them handily. Most of them, I think they beat them all by 2 touchdowns, right? They beat, Anyway, yes. Houston twice, Miami, San Francisco, Jacksonville, all these teams that they played with a winning record. They set the all-time record for wins against teams over 500 in a season, which is amazing. Something to be honestly jealously guarded, to hope that never is beaten. They played in a division where it was just outstanding from top to bottom in terms of what is, and they won it handily. It's just I think there is no way in hell the 2024 Ravens are going to be as good as the 2023 Ravens. But there were people in 2007 asking if the Ravens would be good as they were in 2006. There were people in 2020 asking if they'd be the same as the 2019 Ravens. And there are people in 2001 asking if the defense was going to be even better than it was in 2000. They all were ridiculously, thinking about the thing. The truth of the matter is the Ravens will be worse, but they still could have a good chance to win the Super Bowl. And I'm happy with that trade-off.
Yeah, again, it's almost like what we were talking about it with Lamar's first MVP, and obviously if you want to talk about it with the second MVP too, it's like if Lamar was trending up for the rest of his career, second season after throwing 36 touchdowns, he'd have 70 touchdowns a season by this point. Like, it's not realistic every single season that you're just going to improve, because when you have a historic year, you can't it's unrealistic. You're not breaking history every single year.
Even at age 22, if you have that year, it's not realistic for that to occur. And I think people are going to have to cut Keaton Mitchell some slack when he comes back. He just had the greatest season ever by a running back in 40 plus carries in NFL history, not only in terms of yards per carry, which he did, but he also did it in terms of the DeVoa era, in terms of DeVoa by running back. It happened coincidentally when Devin Achane was having a great year for Miami at the same time. But boy, he was something really, really special. And I guess if I'm looking for a reason why the Ravens won't be as good, is I don't think they can possibly get as much from the combination of backs they'll have this year, with Mitchell being either not present or not as good as the guys they had last year, even with Derrick Henry coming in. Mitchell's 40 carries were just such a level, combined with what Gus Edwards continued to do and what Hill did in a career season. It's just, it'd be really hard for me to imagine that they'd be as good. But Henry can provide in other ways, but I don't think the running game specifically is going to be as good as it was last year.
Yeah, I remember watching kind of like AJ and everything he was doing, and he was ahead of everybody by 5+ in almost every category. And then there was Mitchell, who was just on top of him by 2 or 3. And it was absolutely, I don't think people understand how historic his year was, because I think it was just such a short season for him, where he obviously started the year on IR, came back, and then went on IR again towards the end. But man, he was just absolutely electric for them.
Yeah. Meteoric. And if, I was at the ball game and tweeting as he's going off against the Seattle Seahawks with run after run and missed tackle forced after missed tackle forced. I'm thinking, is anybody getting really excited about this? And then it came back and I listened to the broadcast, and the broadcasters were right on top of it. Whoever was calling that game is saying, wow, they've really found something with Keaton Mitchell. So
Ravens have tens and hundreds of gems and diamonds in the rough, Keaton Mitchell is certainly, even after just one season, maybe not on top of that list, obviously, but he is in that conversation. Now, in terms of the rest of the offseasons we had in the training camp, Ken, is there anything you feel like the Ravens should do in terms of additions, safety, wide receiver, edge, offensive line? Do you think they're pretty much set with what they have heading into the training camp season here?
I think safety is the big need. I'd like them to go cheap on it. I don't like any of the big names, honestly, so to speak. I really don't like Jamal Adams. I don't think he fits their needs at all. So I'd like them to stay away from him. Any of the true strong safety types, I'm not interested in. I'm interested in a free safety. Yep. I think the Ravens could get very unconventional on us and solve this in a different way. And Marlon Humphrey may be a man who comes into the picture as a solution to the safety problem. He may be a guy who, at this point in his career, with his contract being what it is, he's made a ton of money. Maybe he'd be happy moving back to safety and taking a back end role. I think he could cover the split field very well and provide the kind of physical tackling presence they need back there, where Ardarius Washington might be able to do some of the things from an instinct perspective. I don't think all of them that Humphrey can do, but he can't handle the tackling responsibilities in any way like Humphrey can do. So I'd be real excited to see something like that happen. I'd also be excited if they just signed a year 4 guy who's lesser known, who is a vet min guy, but has a history of playing free safety that they would bring in. And they had those guys on the roster last year in the guy who ended up playing for Houston Carson, who ended up playing in the playoff game against them. And Andrews was the other guy who did not end up seeing playing time for them during the regular season, but was a guy they had at the top of the practice squad ready to go for a lot of the year. So they had, they had options, and it's a player like that they need. Whoever they get is not going to be a Geno Stone good, but he's just got to be good enough to get the back end. Daryl Worley is a guy who fit that role already for a brief period of time. If they're out of other options, I think Worley is an excellent guy to try and bring back. And it kind of surprises me that they have not so far, given their relationship with the guy and all the special teams things he's done for them. But so far not. And that guy is out there. Worley is not the only answer. He's an answer as a split field safety.
Right. The safety market really hasn't developed a ton over the course of the offseason. Still a lot of really talented guys out there, but I'm also shocked. I'm a little shocked too they didn't re-sign Daryl Worley. I feel like it was kind of like the obvious answer. And plus, right now your depth is outside of Hamilton and Williams, so Darius Washington, Sanusi Kane, and Bo Braid. And I feel like they need at least one other option there. Not that those young guys can't do it, but I think everybody would feel a lot better if they had the skill set of a Geno Stone, who was one of the main reasons why this defense didn't fall off a cliff with Marcus Williams, because essentially there was no drop off.
Kane and Braid are both guys who I think could be dime backs. Braid probably could work in a strong safety role. I don't think Kane is a guy who is going to go play the back end. I think if you put Braid on the back end, you're not really getting the level of talent you would like to get. So hopefully, they're considering those guys for special teams primarily. I think in terms of Kane, in terms of the new kickoff role, but I don't see them as the answer on the back end.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see an offseason like last year where they're just adding guy after guy after guy before, during, and after training camp. But I do think that one or two additions could certainly be in the cards for the Ravens. Ken, always appreciate your time. Thanks so much for hopping on. Please tell people where they can find you and what you're working on.
All right, wonderful. FilmStudyBaltimore.com is the website. I'm at Film Study Ravens on Twitter. Podcast about 5 days a week during the off season, not quite 7 during the regular season. It's 8 per week typically. So take a look for that. It's on all your podcast platforms where you find. I'm always looking for good guests, and I'll be doing a concerns series. If you would like to be on a film study short with me about a concern about the Baltimore Ravens, hit me up with a DM on Twitter. I'll get back to you very quickly and try and get you on.
Ken does great work. And again, the links to all of his work will be in the description down below. Ken, thanks again. And thank everybody. Thank you for tuning in to Locked On Ravens here. Really appreciate it. Be sure to like and subscribe, video form, audio form, the whole 9 yards. Coming up tomorrow, of course, more Ravens content. Stay tuned for that. I'll see you right back in tomorrow on Locked On Ravens.